Air Canada Flight 624 was supposed to be an uneventful winter arrival into Halifax Stanfield International Airport. A short nighttime journey along the icy Atlantic corridor that pilots had flown for decades. The aircraft, an Airbus A320, lifted off from Toronto with 133 passengers, 5 crew members, and the kind of quiet confidence that accompanies routine. The weather charts showed heavy clouds, moderate turbulence, and freezing wind. Harsh, but not unusual for Nova Scotia in winter. But beyond the expected data, beyond the visible storm layers, beyond the cold that Canadian skies are known for, something else was waiting. Something that would turn a normal descent into one of the most chilling and perplexing aviation mysteries in modern history. Passengers described an eerie stillness before takeoff, a strange hush in the cabin, as if something was listening. The crew brushed it off. Winter flights always felt tense. But the feeling lingered, growing heavier as the aircraft climbed into the night sky. The engines hummed normally. The cabin lights dimmed as passengers settled in. Drinks were served. Laptops glowed. Children slept. The only unusual detail was a temperature drop that the crew chalked up to cabin airflow. But the drop didn't stop. Even with heating increase, the cabin felt colder and colder, not the cold of mechanical failure, but a deep, creeping chill that felt almost alive. At 28,000 feet, the first strange reading appeared. A sensor in the belly of the aircraft reported 62 degrees, far colder than the surrounding atmosphere should have been. The pilots dismissed it as a faulty probe. Airbus sensors sometimes froze in storms, but 10 minutes later, another sensor, located in the cabin floor beneath row 14, reported a similar anomaly. The temperature inside the aircraft was falling, even though all systems were functioning normally. The flight attendants began noticing frost forming on the overhead bins. Not condensation, not ice crystals from cold air hitting warm surfaces. Actual frost, spreading in web-like patterns along the plastic, creeping outward silently, like delicate white veins. One attendant touched the frost and recoiled instantly. It burned her fingers with cold so intense, it felt like heat. She reported it to the cockpit. Inside the cockpit, Captain Joel Mercer and First Officer Dana Foster studied the instruments carefully. Everything appeared normal. No warnings, no failures, no temperature drops indicated. But passengers were reporting cold breath. Seats felt icy. The air had weight, thickness, a sharpness that felt unnatural. It wasn't cabin pressure. It wasn't air conditioning. It was something else. They increased cabin heat again. No change. They shut off air recirculation. No change. They performed a systems reboot. No change. The temperature continued falling. Passengers wrapped themselves in blankets. A baby began crying uncontrollably, not from fear but from cold that pierced through layers of fabric. An elderly man collapsed as frost formed on his oxygen mask. The lights flickered. And then, somewhere deep inside the fuselage, a sound echoed through the floor. A long, low groan. Metal, ice, or something else entirely. At 19,000 feet, the cold reached impossible levels. Passengers near the windows reported seeing frost forming inside the glass panes. A fine layer of ice crawled up the interior, like fingers reaching inward from the night outside. The pilots checked the cabin feed, but the cameras displayed white static, as if the cold itself interfered with the electronics. Then, the cockpit door shifted, not rattled from turbulence, not pushed by crew. Shifted, as if something pressed against it from the cabin side. Mercer unlatched his harness and stood. He opened the door an inch, and immediately slammed it shut. A wave of freezing air burst into the cockpit like a physical force, rolling across the panels and fogging every instrument. Frost spread instantly across the doorframe, forming spiderweb patterns. Whatever was happening inside the cabin, it was worsening. The descent into Halifax had to begin. The pilots initiated approach procedures, but as they did, A new warning flashed on the panel. Ice, detected in non-existent system. Location, internal. Internal ice made no sense. Ice didn't form inside the fuselage of a heated commercial jet. Unless something external, something not part of the aircraft, was entering the aircraft. Outside the aircraft, the storm intensified. Snow whipped past the cockpit windows, erasing the horizon. Radar scanners flickered, airspeed indicators jumped wildly, and then, just when it seemed like nothing stranger could happen, the thermal sensors detected something approaching the aircraft from above. A mass. A cold mass. Descending fast. Not a storm cell, not ice crystals, not turbulence. A shape. Moving directly toward Flight 624. And with it, temperatures inside the cabin plummeted again, dipping below 40 to gang. Cold enough to freeze skin in seconds. Passengers screamed, lights failed. Frost crawled along the ceiling. And something creaked deeply inside the aircraft, as if the metal was responding to a presence. Captain Mercer looked out the left window and saw a shadow, a shape above the wing, shifting, sliding along the fuselage, a patch of sky darker than the storm around it, a shape made of cold itself. Before he could react, the sound hit the aircraft, a deep, resonant crack, like ice splitting open a frozen lake. The entire fuselage shuddered violently. The aircraft dipped. Warnings blared. Flight attendants clung to their jump seats as carts rolled uncontrolled along the aisle, crashing into seats and scattering supplies. Passengers reported something else, something they whispered about later, when they could speak again. They saw their breath forming shapes. Not clouds, shapes, figures, faces, forming in white mist, staring back at them. And then, the cabin lights went out. Darkness, cold, silence. Flight 624 was flying on instruments only. But the worst part wasn't the darkness. It wasn't the frost. It wasn't the screams. It was the footsteps, slow, measured, walking down the aisle, crunching on the frost-covered floor. Something was moving inside the aircraft. Something walking through the dark. Something too cold to belong to this world. The darkness inside Flight 624 was absolute. Not the dim, warm dark of a cabin with lights turned off, but a suffocating, frozen void that swallowed every sound and every breath. Passengers clutched armrests, feeling the cold seep into their bones. Frost thickened across the ceiling in delicate, branching patterns. Oxygen masks swayed gently like pale, frozen vines. And in the middle of that darkness, footsteps echoed through the aisle. Slow, sharp, measured. A heavy weight pressing down on the ice-coated floor, leaving cracks like fractured glass. Captain Mercer and First Officer Foster could hear the steps from the cockpit. They weren't the light steps of a panicking passenger or rushing flight attendant. They were deliberate, spaced perfectly apart, moving with the calm of something that did not fear the cold, because it was the cold. Then, the footsteps stopped. A passenger screamed in the dark, not from pain, not from terror, but from seeing something the human mind wasn't meant to understand. When the emergency cabin lights flickered back to life through the icy darkness, the entire aisle illuminated in a sickly blue glow, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees instantly, as though the light itself triggered the cold's anger. And then everyone saw it. Standing between rows 9 and 10 was a tall, gaunt silhouette. A shape neither human, nor ghost, nor creature. Something carved out of winter itself. Its body was made of shifting frost, swirling snow, and black emptiness. Its limbs were long, jointed unnaturally. Its head was featureless, smooth, pale, icy, like a mask sculpted from frozen fog. Where eyes should have been, two voids absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. Passengers gasped. Some fainted. Others clutched their children. A woman in row 8 pressed herself against the window until frost shattered around her. The cold radiating from the being felt like knives slicing through clothing and skin. And then it moved, not walking, gliding. Its frozen limbs did not bend. Its body did not sway. It slid down the aisle with silent, horrifying grace, as if skating across the frost-covered floor. The pilot saw it too. Captain Mercer slammed the cockpit door shut, but the frost forming around the frame made it feel as if the creature's presence was already seeping inside. "Descent now!" he shouted. His voice cracked with cold. "We bring this thing down now!" Foster initiated a steep emergency descent into Halifax. The aircraft shuddered violently as it pierced through the storm layer. Warning lights flickered across the cockpit: pitot heat overload, cabin pressure instability, airflow anomalies. A cascade of red that made no physical sense. But the creature didn't seem to care. Passengers in the rear screamed as it turned its head sharply toward them, as if sensing heat, or movement, or fear. A man tried to run toward the front, but frost crawled up his legs instantly, trapping him in place. The creature slid forward, and then it touched him. Just one long, icy finger pressed gently against his cheek. His body froze solid in less than 3 seconds. No heartbeat, no movement, no sound. A statue of ice where a man had been moments before. Then, as if bored, the creature continued gliding toward the front of the cabin. Foster pulled the aircraft lower, desperate for warmer air. "If we get below freezing altitude, maybe—" Her sentence stopped as something hit the aircraft. A heavy thud on the fuselage above them. The cockpit ceiling dented inward slightly, frost spreading in a circular pattern from the impact point. Something was outside too. Something crawling across the aircraft's skin. Mercer looked through the left window and felt his stomach drop. A second shape, darker, larger, clung to the wing. Its limbs were long and claw-like, gripping the metal with unnatural strength. Frost exploded outward from its touch, crawling across the flaps and slats. The creature's body shimmered like living ice, twisting in ways no bones could support. When lightning flashed, its outline appeared for just an instant, a hulking mass of crystallized cold and shadow. Then, it looked at him. It had no eyes. Yet he felt its gaze. The engines struggled as ice thickened on the cowling. Warning alarms screamed. Stall, stall, stall. But they were still at 12,000 feet. Too high, too unstable. The creature on the wing shifted its weight. The aircraft rolled left violently. Passengers slammed into the aisle. Overhead bins burst open. A wave of pure cold blasted through the cabin as the first creature extended its arms, almost as if calling something into the aircraft. And then something else changed. The temperature gauge inside the cockpit, a gauge that should never go below 0, dropped to 81 degrees. This was no natural ice. No atmospheric cold, no frost from weather. This was something supernatural, something dimensional, something alive. Foster yelled, "We're losing hydraulics! It's freezing from the inside!" Mercer pulled the emergency generator. "Keep her descending. Don't let the wings stall." Outside, the massive frost creature spread its arms across the wing. Ice tore through the metal like teeth. Fuel lines crackled under pressure. The lights on the wingtip flickered and went out. From the cabin, passengers screamed again as the first creature bent forward, its face inches from one woman's trembling breath. Frost crawled up her lips as she sobbed silently. Then, something even more impossible happened. The intercom turned on. Static, deep, crackling. Then a voice, not human, not mechanical. Low, layered, cold. "We are not your storm." The cabin lights blew out. Darkness again, freezing, hunting, alive. And Flight 624 was falling into the cold's domain. The instant the cabin lights died for the second time, the aircraft felt less like a machine and more like a drifting coffin suspended in a sky made of ice and darkness. The storm outside screamed against the fuselage, but the cold inside the plane was deeper, unnatural, piercing, intelligent. The creatures had brought with them a cold that did not belong to Earth's atmosphere. It felt older than winter itself. Captain Mercer fought the controls with trembling hands. The yoke felt stiff, like frozen metal resisting movement. Frost crept along the instrument panels, even though every heater in the cockpit was working at maximum output. The glass on the windscreen developed ice fractals on the inside, spreading inward in jagged, beautiful patterns that didn't melt under direct heat. Inside the cabin, passengers huddled together, shivering violently, some unable to speak through chattering teeth. Every breath came out as thick vapor. The first creature glided through the aisle like a wraith sculpted from living frost. It moved without sound, without emotion, without weight. Yet every step it took shook the aircraft as if gravity itself responded to it. Then it turned toward the front of the plane. The cockpit door. Foster saw it in the cabin camera feed, even through the static interference. The tall frost entity approaching the door. Her body tensed. "No," she whispered. "Not here. Please, not here." Mercer grabbed the manual door lock. He pushed it down. A crackling sound vibrated through the cockpit, ice spreading rapidly across the metal frame of the door. Frost thickened like a living organism, crawling in tendrils across the hinges, the latch, the emergency panel. Foster screamed, "It's freezing the lock!" Mercer pulled the aircraft into a more aggressive descent. 10,000 feet, 9,800, 9,600, hoping warmer air would weaken the creature. But the cold only intensified. A dull thud reverberated across the cockpit door. Then another. Then a long, scraping drag downward, as if claws of ice were tracing the surface. The temperature reading dropped to 96 degrees C. Foster's skin burned from the cold. Frost formed in her eyelashes. Every breath hurt, like inhaling broken glass. Another thud, harder this time. Then, a crack. The upper hinge splintered with the sound of snapping bone. It was breaking in. The creature on the wing enters. Suddenly, the aircraft lurched violently to the right. The massive creature clinging to the wing had moved again, slamming its body into the fuselage, tearing more metal from the aircraft's structure. The wing flexed dangerously. Ice fractured along the flaps, freezing them in place. The engine sputtered as supercooled ice choked the intake. For a moment, lightning illuminated its form, a towering monstrosity of jagged frost and swirling darkness, its limbs brittle like shattered icicles, its torso hollow, filled with shifting shadows. When lightning flashed again, its head turned toward the cockpit window, even though it had no eyes. And then it reached forward. Long, needle-like fingers of pure frozen air pressed against the cockpit glass. Cracks spider-webbed instantly. Foster screamed as the first layer of cockpit glass ruptured. Snow blasted through a microscopic opening. The pressure inside the cockpit shifted. Warning alarms blared in chaotic sequence. Structural stress overload, pitot failure, altitude drift. Mercer gripped the controls desperately. "We're losing her," Foster gasped. "No," Mercer's voice broke. "Not yet." The impossible mid-air freeze. At 8,000 feet, something happened no aircraft had ever recorded. Every surface inside the plane, seats, walls, windows, metal, skin, froze simultaneously. A pulse of cold spread through the aircraft in less than half a second. Not gradually, instantly. A shockwave of ice. Passengers turned pale as frost crystals formed across their clothing and hair in one swift motion. Water bottles solidified. Coffee froze into black ice inside cups. Tears turned into crystals on children's cheeks. Even sound froze. For a moment, a horrifying moment, the plane fell into absolute silence. No engine roar, no storm, no screaming, just frozen stillness. Mercer felt something inside him shift, as if the cold wasn't just outside his skin, but entering his bloodstream, trying to stop his heart. Then the pulse passed. Sound rushed back. The plane shook violently. Passengers gasped awake as if thawing from a nightmare. But something new had appeared on the radar. A massive, shadowy shape beneath the aircraft. Not a mountain, not a storm pocket, not turbulence. Something moving beneath Flight 624, matching its descent. The radar drew no contours, only a single void-like signature the size of a small building. It rose upward as the aircraft descended, following with perfect precision, like a predator stalking prey. "Is that ground clutter?" Foster whispered. Mercer shook his head slowly. "Ground clutter doesn't move." The cockpit door breaks. The scraping stopped. The thudding stopped, but the cold grew colder. Both pilots looked at the cockpit door, now covered in white frost bending inward from pressure. Ice thickened across the hinges until they snapped off one by one. A long, jagged crack ran down the center of the door. Foster whispered, "It's going to break." And then it happened. The cockpit door shattered inward like brittle glass. A storm of ice and fog spilled. Through the opening, and behind it, the frost creature slid into the cockpit. It moved with slow grace, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it stepped forward. The air around it condensed instantly. Frost spread across every instrument panel. The overhead switches iced over. Mercer's breath froze in midair. The creature hovered inches above the cockpit floor. Its featureless face turned toward Mercer. It tilted its head, studying him, observing, judging, claiming. Foster grabbed a flashlight and shined it directly at the creature. A mistake. The beam of light hit the entity, and the creature's form fluctuated, twisting violently like a storm collapsing into itself. Its limbs extended. A shrill, freezing vibration filled the cockpit, shaking the entire aircraft. Then, it reached out. A hand made of ice and darkness stretched toward the frost creature's hand, hovered centimeters from Captain Mercer's chest, fingers stretching outward like long frozen needles. Foster screamed his name, but her voice was thin, fragile, almost instantly swallowed by the freezing air that thickened the cockpit like a solid weight. Mercer felt his breath locking inside his lungs, as if the creature's presence froze the very molecules needed to keep him alive. His skin burned from cold that sank deeper than temperature, deeper than sensation, cold that felt like it touched his soul. And then the creature pressed its hand forward. Not fast, not violent, slowly, deliberately, with the calm certainty of something that knew he could not escape. As the icy fingertips touched Mercer's chest, his vision blurred. His heartbeat slowed. The world around him dimmed. His own breath formed a thick white mist that didn't dissipate. It hung in front of him like his life was being pulled outward. But the cockpit shook suddenly, violently, as the aircraft hit a patch of heavy turbulence. The frost creature's hand paused. Its head jerked toward the window, sensing something outside. Its body flickered, its form destabilizing slightly. A deep groan echoed across the fuselage, metal straining under pressure. The massive shadow beneath the aircraft surged upward faster, now rising toward the belly of Flight 624 with impossible precision. The frost creature pulled its hand away. Mercer gasped, air stabbing into his lungs like knives as life rushed back. He lurched forward, grabbing the controls with frozen, shaking fingers. 3,500 feet, Foster shouted, voice cracking from cold. "Try to regain—" Mercer coughed, struggling to speak. "Try to regain control." But something else was happening outside. The creature on the wing, the larger one, began to shift its position. It leaned away from the cockpit and raised its elongated arms toward the sky. Its body twisted like a whirlpool of ice and shadow, bending into a shape that resembled a vortex. Faster and faster it spiraled, pulling snow and storm clouds into its form until the entire left side of the aircraft disappeared behind a churning cyclone of frost. Then, the vortex extended toward the fuselage, tearing at the airframe with a suction force that bent metal inward. Passengers screamed as oxygen masks tore free from the ceiling, whipping toward the windows like weightless ribbons. Mercer shouted over the alarms. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Air Canada 624. We are—" His voice cut off, not from shock, not from fear, but because the radios turned to pure static, thick, layered static, the exact same sound that had echoed through the cabin earlier, only now much louder. The frost creature in the cockpit turned suddenly toward the radio panel, as if the sound were calling to it, pulling it, commanding it. Then, the static changed. It deepened, shifted, tuned itself into a single, resonant frequency. A voice, low, layered, inhuman. "You cannot descend," Foster cried out. "What does it want? What does it—" The creature inside the cockpit suddenly flickered violently, its form tearing apart like shredded fog, then reforming. It tilted its head toward Foster this time. Mercer grabbed her wrist. "Don't move," he whispered, barely audible through his frozen throat. "It reacts to movement." But the frost creature didn't attack. Instead, it raised its arm and pointed toward the window, toward the massive shape rising beneath them. And for the first time, Mercer understood. These things weren't the storm. They weren't the cause. They were running from something. The shadow beneath them surged upward again, closer, larger, deeper than before. The radar displayed a huge void, a shape with no edges, no mass, no signature, just a darkness so complete the screen struggled to represent it. Whatever it was swallowing the storm around it. At 2,900 feet, the shadow touched the underside of the aircraft. The entire jet jolted downward violently, so violently that several passengers were thrown from their seats. Frost shuddered along the walls. The lights flickered once, then again, and then every window turned black, not dark, not shadowed, black, as if the aircraft were no longer flying through clouds, but passing through a wall of nothingness. The frost creature in the cockpit recoiled, its form shaking with violent distortion. It slammed its limb against the cockpit roof, as though trying to anchor itself. Foster screamed, "We're falling into it!" Mercer pulled back on the controls, with every ounce of strength left in his frozen muscles. But the aircraft kept falling, 2,500 feet, 2,000 feet, 1,700 feet. The void tightened around the aircraft like a fist. The frost creature wailed, a horrible cracking sound like glaciers breaking apart. Its body began to unravel, its icy limbs dissolving into vapor. Then, something happened that no investigator would ever be able to explain. Every frost-covered window suddenly lit up with blue light, not from outside, from within the void itself. The darkness glowed from the inside, forming swirling patterns of symbols, shapes, spirals, ancient, geometric, alien. The patterns flickered across the windows like messages, or warnings, or commands. Passengers watched in silence, frozen, not by cold, but by awe and terror, as the void revealed structures in its depths, towering pillars of ice, shapes drifting like colossal frozen ghosts, beings larger than skyscrapers, suspended in the black-blue glow, their forms moving slowly, like breathing mountains. The frost creature in the cockpit fell to its knees, not attacking, not reaching, bowing. Mercer whispered through trembling lips, "What is this place?" Foster didn't have time to answer. A third voice, deeper than any storm, older than any winter, filled the aircraft. "You were not meant to enter." The void tightened. Flight 624 dropped to 1,200 feet. Alarms screamed. The aircraft shook so violently that panels ripped free. A passenger was pulled from her seat by a surge of air. Frost burst from the overhead compartments like smoke. The vortex creature on the wing let out a soundless roar, its body exploding into shards of ice that tore through the fuselage like bullets before evaporating into thin air. The frost creature in the cockpit disintegrated entirely, collapsing into a pile of glittering crystals that dissolved instantly. The void squeezed tighter. Mercer's vision dimmed. Foster lost her grip on the controls. 1,000 feet, 900 feet, 800 feet, and then the void released the aircraft. Instantly. The windows cleared. Clouds reappeared. The runway lights of Halifax flickered below. The storm returned. The cold weakened. Flight 624 dropped into real air again. Mercer seized the controls. "Flare! Flare!" Foster pulled the thrust levers forward. The aircraft slammed into the ground, metal screeching, sparks flying, skidding violently across the frozen runway. The wings tore. The landing gear collapsed. The fuselage broke near the front. The cabin filled with smoke and shattered ice. And in the cockpit, Mercer blacked out. He didn't see the shape rising from the runway fog. He didn't see the last frost creature watching the wreckage. He didn't hear the final whisper in the static. "You escaped our world, but the cold remembers you." When Air Canada Flight 624 finally stopped sliding across the frozen runway, the night was split open by the sound of metal screaming against ice. Emergency lights flickered weakly along the shattered fuselage. Smoke drifted upward, mixing with the snow that fell in heavy, dead silence. The aircraft lay broken in 3 sections. Wires hung from torn metal like veins. Cabin seats spilled into the snow. Luggage lay frozen to the ground. And yet, against all odds, there were survivors. 23 passengers and 2 crew members crawled or were pulled from the wreckage by first responders wearing thermal suits. Many suffered frostbite. Some were unconscious. A few shivered violently, even near portable heaters, as if warmth was foreign to them. But the strangest survivors were the ones who weren't physically harmed. The ones who sat still. The ones who stared blankly. The ones who didn't speak a word. Whose pupils were dilated into pure darkness. Their skin was cold to the touch, but not frostbitten, cold like marble. Their breath came out as faint mist even beside heaters. When medics touched them, they didn't react. When medics shouted their names, they didn't respond. It was as if their minds were somewhere else. The strangest passenger of all. A 9-year-old girl was found sitting upright in her seatbelt still fastened, staring straight ahead. Her body temperature was 23 degrees Celsius. She should have been dead, but she blinked. Her lips moved. A medic knelt beside her. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" She didn't answer. She just whispered one thing. Soft, fragile, breathless. "It followed us back." And then she collapsed. The wreckage investigation. Within hours, military personnel arrived and sealed the crash site. Not because of terrorism. Not because of weather. Because of temperature. Even after the crash, even after fuel burned and emergency crews worked, certain parts of the aircraft remained unnaturally cold. 70 degrees C, 82 degrees C, 95 degrees C. Temperatures impossible on Earth's surface. But the cold wasn't uniform. It formed patterns across the fuselage, long branching frost trails that looked like skeletal fingers stretching across metal. These trails converged at 3 main points: the cockpit, the left wing, the cargo hold. When investigators opened the cargo hold, they froze. Literally. A wave of cold surged outward, covering the floor in a sheet of instant ice. Anyone within 6 feet felt the temperature drop so sharply, their breath crystallized. The cargo itself was frozen solid. Bags, suitcases, metal containers, all locked in blocks of ice. But one thing inside the hold wasn't frozen. A small black sphere, smooth, featureless, and warm to the touch. The sphere pulsed faintly. Not heat, not light, but cold. A cold that wasn't natural. A cold that consumed thermal energy, absorbed it, fed on it. The sphere was collected by military personnel. No one ever saw it again. The cockpit. When investigators reached the cockpit, What they found made several turn away. The frost creature's mark remained burned into the metal. Not etched, not scratched, burned by cold. The instrument panels around the captain's seat were warped inward, as though something had pulled heat from the material, so violently the metal shrank. The glass on the displays was cracked from internal freezing, and on the floor, beneath the captain's seat, a thin layer of ice shaped like a human handprint, perfectly detailed, perfectly preserved. But the handprint was not the captain's. It was too long, too slender, too alien. The survivors' reports. Over the following week, survivors regained consciousness. Slowly, unevenly, some screaming from nightmares, some unable to recall names, some speaking nonsense in voices that didn't sound like their own. But eventually, they all said the same thing. When the frost pulses hit the plane, when the void opened beneath them, when the aircraft fell into darkness, they saw another place, not Earth, not sky, not storm. A world made of frozen light. A world where massive beings drifted through blue-black voids. A world where cold was alive. Some survivors described structures, towers of ice that moved like living bones. Others described faces the size of mountains staring at them through the void. One man said he felt something sampling him, reading him. A woman spoke of a presence whispering, "Not your sky." But the strangest report came from the little girl, the one who survived the crash, untouched by physical harm. She said this, "When the plane fell, they almost kept us, but something bigger told them no, something older, something that guards the cold." Investigators asked her what she meant. She answered with a shaking finger pointing into the empty air. It wasn't after us. It was after them, the Frost people. What the government hid, every recording from the plane's black boxes was seized. The thermal damage logs were classified. The sphere found in the cargo hold was taken to a military research base. The survivors were moved to a secure medical facility, and Air Canada 624's final statement was rewritten. Severe winter weather caused loss of control on landing. But the classified report, the one never released, said something else entirely. Air Canada 624 made contact with unknown life forms composed of sub-zero matter. Origin, non-terrestrial, non-atmospheric. Motivation, unknown. Threat level, extreme. Probability of reoccurrence, high. Containment priority, maximum. The final truth. 3 days after the crash, thermal cameras around the wreck site detected a moving cold mass traveling along the runway. It drifted slowly, deliberately, as if searching. When military personnel approached, the mass vanished instantly, as though stepping into a world only it could enter. But it left behind one thing: frost patterns in the snow that resembled footprints, long, thin, inhuman, and arranged in a line leading away from the wreck, toward the woods, toward darkness, toward the world beyond Halifax. One final message arrived on the emergency radio frequency that night. In the same voice the passengers heard in the void. "The cold remembers." The investigation was closed, but the cold remained.